In this video, we are going to hear three perspectives on how we can shift our political and economic models and deploy technology to create a more sustainable and prosperous future. We will hear from David Boyd, author of The Optimistic Environmentalist, George Papandreou, former Prime Minister of Greece and advocate for participatory democracy, and Rik Daems, the president of the European Network of Contact Parliamentarians for a Healthy Environment, who, as an economically liberal Belgian senator, has been called an unlikely environmentalist. We'll begin by hearing from David Boyd about why he remains optimistic in the face of serious challenges to our climate and environment.
Why I feel optimistic today? Well, I think there's enormous grounds for optimism in terms of some of the technologies that are emerging to address the climate crisis. And this isn't just hand waving at this point. We know from literally hundreds of different human inventions that there's something called the technology S-curve, which means that whenever a new technology comes along, whether it was radios a century ago, refrigerators, as you mentioned, air conditioners, smartphones is a really good example. At the beginning, there's a very slow level of uptake of these new technologies as people who are kind of early adopters weigh in. The costs are generally quite high. But then as more and more people purchase these items, the cost comes down, the public acceptance goes up, and there's a tipping point at which things just take off. And that tipping point is usually around 5% of the public having access to a certain technology. And the really exciting news from a climate crisis perspective is that we've passed that 5% threshold in a number of really game-changing technologies, which include solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, lithium-ion batteries, and heat pumps. And all five of these technologies that I've just mentioned are far greener than their existing technologies.
They would say environmentalism is something for rich people in elite jobs like the two of us who can afford certain solutions right now. And for the vast majority of people, these are just not attainable, they would argue. What would you answer to them?
I would say that's an absolutely false premise. If we look at electricity, for example, across low-income nations, there are still literally hundreds of millions of people who do not have access to electricity. One of the greatest priorities we should have as a society is to provide electricity to the people who don't have it. And the cheapest way to do that in the year 2022 is through renewable sources of electricity, solar panels and wind turbines. Where I travel to major cities in wealthy nations, for example, Oslo in Norway, just recently was in Lisbon and Porto in Portugal, also Ljubljana in Slovenia. All of these cities are doing actually amazing things to make themselves greener, creating additional green spaces, improving public transit systems, switching to renewable forms of energy. And so there's real hope there in that green city movement.
So, if the technology exists, is cheaper than more ecologically damaging alternatives, and is being successfully deployed in some places, why is it not being rolled out everywhere at the urgent pace needed to avert serious consequences of climate change? Do people not want change? In fact, in the UN People's Climate Vote survey of 1.2 million people across 50 countries, 64% of respondents considered climate change an emergency, and 59% of these said that the world should do everything necessary and urgently in response. Unfortunately, in many countries, the political system has become less representative of the will of the people. That's why former Prime Minister of Greece, George Papandreou, sees participatory democracy as a key opportunity to bring about the changes needed to address climate change.
These are major changes. We cannot do this. And I would say this as being in politics in many, many years in my life. I don't believe that one politician or one leader or one savior is going to come with a solution, or even an expert. We need to work together. We need an inclusive participatory process, because that means that the ownership of the change will be by citizens. And also what we have seen is, in fact, there is a collective intelligence, which we often forget, that actually when you bring people together, collective intelligence can be often much more effective in finding solutions, particularly social solutions, than either one expert, even the best, or one politician, or one party, and so on. So the citizens' assemblies, and not only the citizens' assemblies, this is one form of a new form of participative democracy, would basically allow a representative group to deliberate and break down the sense that only those who are elected, or only those who are powerful have a say. What if we decided to build a digital platform, which would be a deliberative platform as a fourth branch of government, where you would be sort of an electronic agora, an e-agora, where you actually would say, and I tried this when I was prime minister, you would say, before I go to make a policy decision, before I take something to parliament to be voted on, before I make a decision as a government, I'm going to put these questions and these proposals on our digital platform. And I will let all citizens participate and make it easy enough for them to actually vote on some issues or deliberate on issues. It will take some time and some training, and decisions will be made that are not necessarily the best. We have to have certain rules and respect certain rules, because we've seen the problems of some of these digital platforms. For example, the polarization and the cocooning. When you have one digital platform where everybody has to talk about one law, you are basically have to have the opposing views on the same platform. You can't sort of go off with your own friends and just shout about the other guys.
Rik Daems sees that both political and economic changes are needed.
The point that I want to make is that the environment concerns us all. So there's no room for having a left-right debate here. If you look at the floods, if you look at the tornadoes, if you look at the wildfires, if you look at the food problematics, if you look at climate migrants, if you just add all of that up and you put a cost next to it, to me, it is quite clear that the cost of climate change, the cost of not taking care of our environment, is far higher than the investment that we should do in order to avoid climate change. So that on the basis itself is a very strong economic case, because that's about money. People tend to think that economy and ecology are opposed to each other. Now, this is simply not true. Of course, you've got today an economy that exists, which is not environmentally friendly. And so you need to transition from there to becoming at least not environmental damaging, right? And yes, that's an investment. So politically speaking, what you need to do, and this is why the network is so important, is to politically, in the parliaments, through the government, say, hey, all technology, done with it, you need to you need to go over to new technologies. And that also means that you need to invest in these new technologies. And there again, the same logic comes up. The cost of climate change is largely higher than the investment of new technologies to go and to combat it. Why don't we think in terms of new concepts? One that I've been promoting for decades now is the cradle to cradle, principle. Cradle to cradle basically means if you make a product, make sure that at the end of the life cycle of the product, you can reuse it. It's completely different than the logic of I make a product and then it's waste and then we've got to do something with the waste. No. And so the cradle to cradle thing is something that also has an economic benefit, because again, at the end of the life cycle, the cost, if you take it on an average, will be lower. Another issue that might be on the table is why don't we go into environmental responsibility bonds? I mean, you can go to the broader public. It's not only private equity funds. You can go to you and myself and everyone saying, listen, we ask money, we'll give you a certain yield on your money, provided that the results are there. So that's result driven. It's a bit between equity and bonds, if you wish. And it's like the social responsibility bonds that exist. You can make green responsibility bonds. And I think that a broad part of the public will go into that. So I don't think it's a question of not having enough money to do it. It's a question of a mindset. It's a question of mentality within the executive and also the broader public. Say, hey, we benefit from a better environment. Maybe it'll take a little bit of time in order to make the change, but at the end of the day, we will all benefit from it. The citizen, it can hold a government or a political party or politicians responsible for what is going wrong. Why? Because in every so many years, they can have a vote and say, you're out, you're in. Accountability is different. Because now here, you can be, between brackets, punished or held accountable, if you wish, immediately and yourself. And so the single most important measure that I would feel that have the largest impact is inscribing the right to a safe, healthy, and clean environment into this European Convention, which allows citizens to go to a court and to hold accountable a sitting executive. And then again, then the economic logic will come up. Because again, I mean, if you can get penalized and have to pay a lot of fines, then you will reason, oh, how can I avoid that? Well, maybe by putting policies in place that go into the right direction, which are not left, which are not right. They're just protecting the environment for all of us.